The year was 1945, and the world had just witnessed the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. But for a small group of Japanese women stepping off transport ships onto American soil, their journey was just beginning. These weren't the hardened soldiers that propaganda posters had depicted. They were clerks, nurses, radio operators, and auxiliaries who had served the Imperial Japanese military in various capacities across the Pacific Theater. Now, as prisoners of war, they found themselves facing an uncertain fate in the land they had been taught to fear above all else. What happened next would challenge everything they believed about their captors, their country, and themselves. The story I'm about to tell you isn't one you'll find in most history books. It's a tale of unexpected humanity in the midst of war's aftermath, where the simple taste of American apple pie would reduce battle-hardened women to tears. But not for the reasons you might think. The transport ships that carried these women across the Pacific were floating contradictions. Below deck, in cramped quarters that smelled of diesel fuel and disinfectant, the prisoners huddled together, whispering prayers and preparing for the worst. They had been indoctrinated since childhood to believe that capture meant disgrace worse than death itself. The concept of surrender violated everything the Bushido Code had taught them. To be taken alive was to bring shame upon their families, their ancestors, and their emperor. Yet here they were, alive stained the American coast, larger through salt and breathing, watching line grow earth holes. Some never see again. Others held on to clutched photographs of families they might small personal items, unsure if they would be allowed to keep even these meager possessions. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. What awaited them in America? Torture, humiliation, public execution as examples to others? The reality they encountered was far more complex than their fears had prepared them for. As the ships docked at various American ports, the women were processed with an efficiency that bordered on bureaucratic indifference. No jeering crowds awaited them. No soldiers spat at their feet or struck them with rifle butts. Instead, they were counted, cataloged, and loaded onto buses with the same methodical precision that characterized American military operations throughout the war. The journey inland revealed a country that defied every expectation. Through bus windows, they witnessed an America untouched by the devastation that had consumed their homeland. Cities stood intact, their skylines reaching toward clear blue skies. Children played in yards where flowers bloomed and grass grew green. Shop windows displayed goods that had become distant memories in wartime Japan. This was supposed to be the enemy's homeland. Yet it looked like paradise compared to the bombed-out ruins they had left behind. When the buses finally reached their destinations, the prisoners found themselves at facilities that challenged every preconceived notion about American cruelty. The camps were surrounded by fences, yes, but they were orderly, clean, almost institutional in their appearance. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, their exteriors painted and maintained. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter, but even these seemed less menacing than expected. The American soldiers who processed them spoke in measured tones, following procedures that seemed designed more for organization than intimidation. The first real shock came during the delousing process. The women had steeled themselves for degradation, for the kind of humiliation they had been warned would accompany capture. Instead, they found themselves handed bars of soap, real soap that smelled faintly of flowers. The showers produced streams of hot water, a luxury many hadn't experienced in months. Clean towels and fresh clothing followed. For women who had grown accustomed to the harsh realities of wartime rationing, these simple amenities felt almost surreal. But it was in the mess hall that the true revelation began. The aroma hit them first, wafting through the air like an impossible dream. Fresh bread, cooked meat, coffee, and something else, something sweet and distinctly foreign. The women filed through the serving line with trembling hands, watching as American cooks ladled generous portions onto metal trays. Beef stew with actual chunks of meat. Bread so white and soft it seemed like cake. Vegetables they recognized but hadn't tasted in years. And then, at the end of the line, slices of golden-crusted pie, steam still rising from the latticed tops. Apple pie, the quintessential American dessert. To the Japanese women, it was an alien creation. Its cinnamon-spiced filling and flaky crust unlike anything in their culinary tradition. They carried their trays to long wooden tables, sitting in stunned silence as they contemplated the feast before them. Some hesitated, convinced this abundance must be a trap. Others worried the food might be poisoned. But hunger, real hunger born of months of wartime rations, eventually overcame caution. The first taste of apple pie was a revelation. The sweetness exploded across their tongues, followed by the warm spices of cinnamon and nutmeg. The tender apples melted in their mouths, contrasting with the buttery, flaky crust. For many, it was the first sweet thing they had tasted in years. The sugar, real sugar, not the ersatz substitutes they had grown accustomed to, sent waves of pleasure through their malnourished bodies. That's when the tears began. Not tears of despair or humiliation, but something far more complex. These were tears of confusion, of gratitude, of grief for everything they had lost. Here they were, prisoners of war in enemy territory, being fed better than they had been in their own country during the final desperate months of the conflict. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could their captors show them such kindness? How could the enemy they had been taught to hate provide them with comforts their own government had denied them? One woman, a former radio operator named Akiko, later recalled that moment in interviews conducted decades later. She described how the pie's sweetness reminded her of festivals from her childhood, of better times before the war consumed everything. As she ate, tears streaming down her face, she felt something crack inside her. Some wall of hatred and fear that had been carefully constructed by years of propaganda. The American guards watched these emotional displays with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, unsure how to interpret the reactions of their unusual prisoners. The psychological impact extended far beyond that first meal. Over the following days and weeks, as the women adjusted to life in the camps, they were forced to reconcile their expectations with reality. They had been prepared for cruelty but found structure. They had anticipated starvation but discovered abundance. They had expected degradation but encountered a strange kind of dignity. The dignity of being treated according to international conventions rather than the harsh realities of total war. The daily routine in the camps further challenged their preconceptions. Meals arrived with mechanical regularity, each one a reminder of American abundance. Work assignments were available for those who wanted them, paying small wages in camp scrip that could be used at the commissary. The commissary itself was another shock. Shelves stocked with chocolates, cigarettes, toiletries, and other luxuries that had disappeared from Japan years earlier. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, painted a picture of a homeland in ruins. Families wrote of eating grass and tree bark to survive. Children begged for scraps of bread that their imprisoned daughters and sisters now took for granted. The contrast was almost unbearable. How could they explain to their starving families that they, as prisoners, were eating meat every day? How could they describe the guilt that accompanied each bite of apple pie, knowing their loved ones were slowly starving in the wreckage of their defeated nation? The American guards, too, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Many had expected to encounter the fanatical enemies depicted in wartime propaganda. Instead, they found themselves supervising women who seemed more bewildered than hostile. Some guards began to recognize the humanity in their charges, seeing past the uniform to the individual beneath. Small acts of kindness became common. A shared cigarette, a helping hand with heavy work, or simply a nod of acknowledgement that transcended the barriers of language and ideology. This unexpected humanity created its own complications. The women had been raised in a culture that valued loyalty and sacrifice above individual comfort. To accept kindness from the enemy felt like betrayal, yet to refuse it seemed foolish given their circumstances. The apple pie became a symbol of this moral complexity, its sweetness a constant reminder of the contradictions they faced every day. As weeks turned into months, the women found themselves caught in a peculiar form of limbo. The apple pie that had initially shocked them became a regular feature of their meals, its presence both comforting and deeply unsettling. Each slice served as a reminder of their complex situation, prisoners who were treated better than many free citizens in their devastated homeland. The camps operated with a clockwork precision that was both reassuring and alien. Morning réveillé came not with harsh shouts, but with the measured tone of duty sergeants calling roll. Breakfast followed predictable patterns: eggs and bacon, toast with real butter, coffee that steamed in ceramic cups. The women learned to navigate the serving lines, to understand the rhythms of American institutional life. Yet beneath this routine lay persistent questions that gnawed at their understanding of the world. Letters continued to arrive from Japan, though increasingly infrequent as the postal system struggled to function in the occupied territories. Those that did reach the camps painted ever darker pictures of life in the aftermath of surrender. Families described winter nights without fuel, children too weak to play, elderly relatives dying from malnutrition. One woman received word that her younger brother had succumbed to tuberculosis, his body too weakened by hunger to fight the disease. She read the letter while sitting before a slice of apple pie, untouched and growing cold, unable to reconcile the sweetness before her with the bitterness of loss. The psychological weight of abundance became its own form of torment. The women discovered that guilt could be heavier than hunger, that comfort could be more painful than deprivation when it came at such a cost. Some began to refuse certain foods, unable to bear the contrast with their family's suffering. Others ate mechanically, their minds elsewhere, trying to separate the act of survival from the implications of plenty. American military psychologists, studying the unusual situation, noted the complex emotional responses of their prisoners. Unlike male POWs, who often displayed more straightforward patterns of resistance or compliance, these women exhibited what researchers later termed moral displacement anxiety. They were caught between loyalty to their homeland and gratitude for their treatment, between cultural expectations and biological needs. The apple pie, in particular, seemed to trigger intense emotional responses that went far beyond simple appreciation for food. Work details provided some respite from the psychological burden of captivity. Women were assigned to various tasks around the camps and nearby communities, always under guard, but with surprising freedom of movement. They worked in laundries, cleaned administrative buildings, and helped with food preparation. Some were assigned to nearby farms during harvest season, their labor contributing to the very abundance that fed them. The irony was not lost on them: Japanese hands harvesting American apples that would become the pies they both craved and resented. In the camp kitchens, some women learned the secrets of American baking. They watched as cooks rolled out pie crusts, mixed sugar with sliced apples, and added spices whose names they struggled to pronounce in English. The process fascinated them. This transformation of simple ingredients into something that could evoke such powerful emotions. A few brave souls asked to help, their curiosity overcoming cultural barriers. The American cooks, often farm boys themselves who understood the universal language of food, welcomed the assistants with shy smiles and patient instruction. These culinary exchanges became small bridges across the divide of war. Language barriers dissolved in the shared vocabulary of cooking. A Japanese woman might not know how to say "delicious" in English, but her smile as she tasted a perfectly spiced apple filling needed no translation. American soldiers, many of whom had never traveled far from their hometowns before the war, discovered that their former enemies could laugh at the same simple pleasures, could take pride in the same small accomplishments. The seasonal cycle brought new complexities to their situation. As autumn arrived, the camps organized harvest festivals, American traditions that seemed almost mystical to women raised in a culture of rice and seasonal ceremonies. They watched in wonder as guards carved jack-o'-lanterns and decorated mess halls with cornstalks and pumpkins. The apple harvest reached its peak, and the pies became even more frequent, their crusts golden with the promise of American autumn. Some women began to keep journals, writing in careful Japanese characters about their experiences. These private documents, many of which survived the decades that followed, provide intimate glimpses into the psychological landscape of captivity. One entry, written by a former nurse named Sachiko, captured the essence of their dilemma. She described watching American children through the camp fence, their cheeks rosy with health, their laughter carrying on the wind. Then she wrote of the apple pie served that evening, how its sweetness had reminded her of her own childhood before the war changed everything. The contrast between their treatment and reports from other theaters of conflict became increasingly apparent. News filtered through about Allied prisoners in Japanese camps, stories of brutality and starvation that made the women's current circumstances seem almost luxurious by comparison. This knowledge added another layer to their emotional burden. How could they reconcile their relatively comfortable captivity with the knowledge that their countrymen had shown no such mercy to enemy prisoners? Medical examinations revealed the physical transformation that adequate nutrition had wrought. Women who had arrived gaunt and hollow-cheeked began to fill out, their bodies responding to regular meals and proper protein. The camp doctors, many of whom were young men fresh from medical school, marveled at the rapid improvement in their patients' health. Blood tests showed rising levels of essential nutrients. Dental examinations revealed the first signs of healing in mouths ravaged by wartime malnutrition. Even their hair, once brittle and dull, began to regain its natural luster. Yet this physical restoration came with psychological complications. As their bodies healed, their minds grappled with questions of identity and loyalty. Who were they becoming in this place? Were they still the same women who had served their emperor with unwavering dedication? Or had the apple pie and clean sheets and gentle treatment begun to transform them into something else, something their families might not recognize? The American personnel running the camps found themselves dealing with questions they had never anticipated. Military handbooks covered the basics of prisoner management, but they offered little guidance on how to handle the complex emotional needs of women caught between worlds. Some guards, touched by the obvious distress of their charges, began small beyond official policy. A guard might acts of kindness that went save an extra apple from his own meal for a woman who had received particularly bad news from home. Another might allow a prisoner to tend a small garden plot, understanding instinctively that the act of nurturing growing things provided psychological comfort. The seasons turned, and with them came new traditions and new complications. Christmas approached, bringing with it American customs that seemed both foreign and strangely appealing. The camps were decorated with evergreen boughs and colored lights. Carols played on radio systems, their melodies unfamiliar but somehow universal in their message of hope and peace. Special meals were planned, featuring turkey and stuffing and, inevitably, more apple pie. For women raised in a culture where Christianity had been suppressed and Western holidays viewed with suspicion, these celebrations posed new dilemmas. Some found themselves genuinely moved by the music and the decorations, by the obvious joy the season brought to their captors. Others felt that participating in any way would be another betrayal of their heritage. The apple pie served on Christmas Day became more than dessert. It was a choice, a statement about who they were becoming and what they were willing to accept. As winter deepened, the psychological effects of their situation became more pronounced. Some women adapted remarkably well, learning English phrases and American customs with surprising ease. They began to see their captivity not as punishment, but as an unexpected education, a chance to understand the enemy that had defeated them. Others retreated into themselves, clinging to memories of home and refusing to engage with their new reality. The apple pie became a dividing line between these two groups, those who could accept its sweetness and those who found it too bitter a reminder of their complicated circumstances. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. By spring of 1946, these women bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed prisoners who had stumbled off the transport ships months earlier. Their faces had filled out, color had returned to their cheeks, and some had even begun to smile with genuine warmth rather than polite obligation. The apple pie that had once seemed so foreign now appeared regularly on their meal trays, its presence as routine as the morning bell that woke them each day. Yet beneath this surface adaptation, deeper currents of change were flowing. The women found themselves thinking in English phrases they had unconsciously absorbed. They caught themselves humming American melodies heard over the camp's radio system. Small gestures had become second nature, the way they now held their forks, the manner in which they queued for meals, even the casual nods they exchanged with guards who had become familiar faces rather than faceless enemies. Dr. Margaret Harrison, one of the few female personnel assigned to the camps, documented these changes in her monthly reports to the War Department. She observed that the prisoners exhibited what she termed adaptive resilience, a psychological flexibility that allowed them to maintain their core identity while incorporating elements of their new environment. The apple pie, she noted, had become a particularly potent symbol of this adaptation. Women who had initially recoiled from its unfamiliar sweetness now anticipated dessert time with visible pleasure. The letters from home continued to arrive, SPO one a window radically, each into a world that seemed increasingly distant. Families wrote of the occupation, of American soldiers distributing food to starving civilians, of democracy taking root in soil that had been tilled by centuries of imperial rule. The irony was inescapable. Their countrymen were learning to accept American kindness as defeated civilians, while they, as prisoners, had been experiencing it all along. One letter, received by a woman named Keiko, who had served as a communications specialist, contained news that shattered her carefully constructed emotional equilibrium. Her elderly father had died during the harsh winter, his body finally succumbing to malnutrition and cold. But the letter also contained something unexpected. Her younger sister had married an American soldier, one of the occupying forces who had shown kindness to their family during the darkest days after surrender. The wedding had featured, of all things, an apple pie instead of traditional rice cakes, a symbol of the new world being born from the ashes of the old. Keiko read this news while sitting in the camp's small library, a slice of apple pie growing cold beside her. The sweetness that had once seemed like betrayal now tasted of something else entirely. Perhaps acceptance, perhaps hope. She found herself wondering if her father might have enjoyed such a simple pleasure before his death. If the Americans had shown him the same unexpected kindness she had experienced in captivity. The psychological complexity of their situation deepened as news of the war crimes trials reached the camps. Reports filtered in of Japanese officers being prosecuted for the brutal treatment of Allied prisoners. Stories that made the women acutely aware of the contrast in their own treatment. Some felt shame for their nation's actions, while others struggled with resentment that their countrymen were being judged by standards that their captors had chosen to uphold, rather than abandon in revenge. American camp commanders found themselves walking an increasingly delicate line. Official policy demanded that the prisoners be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, but the reality of managing several hundred women for an indefinite period required flexibility and innovation. The apple pie had become more than dessert. It was a tool of pacification, a symbol of American values, and a small daily reminder of the power dynamic that governed their lives. Some guards began to learn basic Japanese phrases. Their efforts at communication met with surprised delight by the prisoners. These linguistic bridges, however fragile, allowed for deeper human connections. A guard might Ishide learn to say "osu" when complimenting the apple pie, while a prisoner might respond with "thank you very much" in carefully practiced English. These exchanges, simple as they were, represented something profound. The gradual erosion of the barriers that war had erected between peoples. The seasonal rhythms of American life continued to shape their experience. Spring brought baseball games visible through the camp fences, the crack of bat against ball carrying across the compound like a foreign song. Some women learned the basic rules by watching, their competitive spirits kindled despite themselves. Summer introduced them to 4th of July celebrations, complete with fireworks that reminded them uncomfortably of bombardments, but also filled them with an unexpected sense of wonder at their beauty. Throughout these seasonal changes, the apple pie remained constant. Its recipe never varied significantly, but the women's relationship with it continued to evolve. What had begun as shock and confusion had progressed through stages of reluctant acceptance, guilty pleasure, and finally something approaching genuine appreciation. The pie had become a measuring stick for their psychological journey, each slice a marker of how far they had traveled from the women who had first set foot on American soil. The camp's small medical facility documented the physical changes that proper nutrition had wrought. Weight gain was universal, with most women achieving healthy body mass index for the first time in years. Dental health improved dramatically as access to sugar and proper hygiene products reversed years of wartime neglect. But perhaps most remarkably, the medical staff noted a significant decrease in stress-related ailments. The constant anxiety that had characterized the early months of captivity had given way to something resembling peace, however complicated that peace might be. Dr. Harrison's interviews with individual prisoners revealed the depth of their transformation. Women spoke of dreams that had changed character, nightmares of bombardment and starvation replaced by confused visions of American plenty. Some reported dreaming in English, their subconscious minds processing their daily experiences in the language of their captors. Others described dreams of home where apple pie appeared on family tables, impossible visions that their sleeping minds struggled to reconcile. The approach of autumn brought with it the first serious discussions of repatriation. The war had been over for more than a year, and pressure was mounting to return prisoners to their homeland. For the women, this prospect evoked complex emotions. Many longed desperately to see their families again, to return to familiar landscapes and customs. Others found themselves surprisingly reluctant to leave the security and abundance of the camps for the uncertain prospects awaiting them in occupied Japan. The apple pie served during these discussions seemed to carry additional weight. Each bite represented a pleasure that might soon be lost, a sweetness that might not be replicated in their devastated homeland. Some women began to request the recipe, hoping to recreate this symbol of their captivity in whatever kitchens they might find upon their return. American cooks, touched by these requests, carefully wrote out ingredients and instructions, translating measurements and techniques as best they could. As preparations for repatriation began in earnest, the emotional atmosphere in the camps grew increasingly complex. Some women approached their pending departure with excitement, counting days until they could embrace family members they had not seen in years. Others found themselves paralyzed by anxiety, uncertain about what role they would play in a Japan that had been fundamentally transformed by defeat and occupation. The final apple pies served in the camps carried symbolic weight that none could ignore. For some, they represented the strange interlude of abundance between the deprivations of an unexpected chapter in their lives, symbolized a transformation that could never be fully reversed, a suite of war and the uncertainties of peace. For others, they nests that would forever complicate their understanding of enemy and friend, captor and protector. The buses that would carry them to the ships waiting in American harbors stood ready, their engines idling like mechanical harbingers of change. The women gathered their few possessions, many of which bore the unmistakable stamp of American manufacture. Clean clothes, bars of soap, small gifts from guards who had come to know them as individuals rather than symbols. Turned back for final glimpses of the compounds. Some clutched carefully copied recipes, their handlight. The barracks that writing mixing Japanese characters with English words in testament had sheltered them bore witness to their hybrid experience as they filed toward the buses for the last time. Many to conversations and confessions that had transformed silent in the morning, perhaps Bedissem buildings would soon house other prisoners or their understanding of the world. These that had housed them for so many months. The mess halls where they had first tasted apple pie stew-antled entirely, but their impact on the women who had lived within them would endure for lifetimes. The journey to the ports retraced the route they had traveled upon arrival, but everything had changed. The women who boarded the ships bore little resemblance to those who had disembarked in fear and confusion more than a year earlier. They carried with them not just possessions and recipes, but fundamentally altered perspectives on human nature. on the possibilities for kindness even in the midst of conflict, and on the complex sweetness of survival in an uncertain world. The ships that would carry them back to Japan cut through Pacific at the rail seemed both waters that coastlines fade familiar and foreignings, watching American. The women stood into memory, their hearts heavy with contradictions they could barely articulate. In their belong-wrapped and protectings, carefully, were handwritten recipes for apple pie, translated into Japanese characters by sympathetic American cooks who had come to understand the simple dessert. The ocean-profound significance of that voyage provided time for reflection that many had been avoiding during the busy preparations for departure. In the ship's hold, conversations women shared experiences they had kept, flowed in hushed tones as private during their captivity. Some spoke of the guilt-comfortable meal, the way abundance that accompanied each had felt like betrayal when letters from home described starvation. Others confessed to moments of genuine happiness, instances when they had forgotten in the camps. Brief, they were prisoners and simply enjoyed the warmth of human kindness. Akiko, the former radio operator who had been among the first to taste apple pie with tears streaming down her face, found herself appointed as an informal leader among the returning prisoners. Her English had improved dramatically during Caput as translator for those Cividi, and she served who struggled with the language barrier. But more than linguistic skills, she possessed something harder to define, of having a wisdom born navigated the treacherous waters between loyalty and survival, between hatred and gratitude. The conversations during the voyage revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. They spoke of American customs they had observed, of holidays they had witnessed, of small kindnesses that had accumulated over months of captivity. The apple pie emerged repeatedly in these discussions, not merely as food, but as a symbol of everything that had challenged their understanding of the world. Some admitted they had begun to crave its sweetness, that the combination of cinnamon and nutmeg had become as familiar as the taste of rice. Dr. Harrison, who accompanied the group as part of the repatriation mission, continued her documentation of their psychological state during the voyage. Her notes revealed women caught between worlds, carrying within themselves elements of both cultures that might never fully integrate. They had learned to appreciate American directness while maintaining Japanese politeness. They had absorbed concepts of individual dignity while retaining deep respect for group harmony. The apple pie had become a catalyst for this cultural fusion, its foreign sweetness now part of their emotional vocabulary. As the ship approached Japanese waters, anxiety levels rose perceptibly among the returning prisoners. Many had received no recent correspondence from their families, leaving them uncertain about what awaited them. Would their loved ones view them as survivors or as collaborators? Would their healthy appearance, the obvious signs of good nutrition and medical care, be seen as evidence of betrayal rather than fortune? The recipes they carried seemed suddenly dangerous, potential proof that they had embraced enemy culture too readily. The first sight of Japan's coastline brought tears to many eyes, but these were different from the tears shed over apple pie in American mess halls. These were tears of recognition mixed with sorrow, joy tempered by uncertainty. The landscape bore scars of war that were visible even from the ship's deck. Cities remained partially in ruins, their skylines broken by empty lots where buildings had once stood. The contrast with the American abundance they were leaving behind was stark and immediate. Processing at Japanese ports proved more complex than their initial capture had been. American occupation forces handled the paperwork with familiar efficiency, but Japanese officials approached the returning women with visible suspicion. Questions were asked about their treatment, about their activities during captivity, about their current loyalties. Some officials seemed surprised by the women's apparent good health, their clean clothes, their confident bearing. The apple pie recipes, discovered during baggage inspections, raised particular interest and concern. The journey inland revealed a Japan that had been fundamentally transformed by defeat and occupation. American military vehicles shared roads with Japanese civilians on foot or bicycle. English signs appeared alongside Japanese characters in major cities. The smell of unfamiliar cooking drifted from military compounds, including the distinctive aroma of baking that reminded the returning women of the desserts they had learned to appreciate in captivity. Family reunions, when they occurred, were emotionally complex affairs. Parents and siblings who had last seen these women as committed servants of the empire now encountered individuals who had been shaped by extended contact with American culture. The returning prisoners found themselves code-switching between the Japanese they had spoken in childhood and the hybrid language they had developed during captivity, peppered with English phrases and American expressions. Some families welcomed their returning daughters and sisters with overwhelming relief, grateful simply for their survival in circumstances that had claimed so many lives. Others struggled to reconcile the women before them with their memories of who these individuals had been before the war. The healthy appearance of the returnees, their obvious signs of good nutrition and medical care, sometimes provoked resentment rather than celebration. Why had they thrived while family members at home had suffered deprivation? The apple pie recipes became sources of both curiosity and controversy within families. Some relatives were fascinated by these glimpses into American domestic life, eager to understand the culture that had shaped their loved ones' recent experiences. Others viewed the recipes as evidence of dangerous cultural contamination, symbols of how the enemy had succeeded in winning hearts and minds through simple pleasures. A few brave family members attempted to recreate the desserts, struggling to find ingredients in post-war Japan that could approximate the American abundance their relatives remembered. Keiko, who had learned of her father's death and her sister's marriage to an American soldier while still in captivity, found her homecoming particularly fraught. Her sister's new life embodied the cultural transformation that many Japanese were experiencing under occupation. The apple pie that had been served at her sister's wedding had become a family legend, a story told with mixture of pride and bewilderment. For Keiko, it represented the strange continuity between her captivity experience and her family's adaptation to post-war reality. The psychological adjustment to life in occupied Japan proved challenging for many returnees. They had grown accustomed to the abundance and relative comfort of American prison camps, where food was regular. Shelter was adequate reality of post-war Japan, even with American and medical care was available. The aid programs involved continued rationing, damaged infrastructure, and economic uncertainty. Some women found themselves longing for the predictable routines of camp life, a confession that filled them with shame even as they could not deny its truth. Employment opportunities for former prisoners proved limited and complicated. Some found work with American occupation forces, their English language skills and cultural familiarity making them valuable interpreters and administrative assistants. Others struggled to find any work at all, their status as former prisoners creating suspicion among potential employers. The apple pie recipes, ironically, provided some women with unexpected opportunities as they shared American baking techniques with Japanese commercial kitchens eager to cater to occupation personnel. Dr. Harrison's follow-up studies, conducted during visits to Japan in the months following repatriation, revealed the ongoing complexity of the returnees' psychological state. Many continued to dream about their captivity experiences, but these dreams had evolved from nightmares of capture to complex narratives that blended memory with imagination. The apple pie appeared frequently in these dreams, sometimes as comfort food, sometimes as symbol of loss, always as reminder of a period more dangerous and more hopped, when the world had seemed bountiful than they had previously imagined. The women formed informal support networks, gathering periodically to share their experiences and provide mutual understanding that family members and friends could not always offer. These meetings often featured attempts to recreate American foods from their memories, with apple pie holding special significance as the dessert that had marked their first recognition of enemy humanity. The recipes they had carried home proved inadequate guides to the complex alchemy of American baking, but the attempts themselves provided cathartic connection to their shared experience. Some returnees became advocates for improved Japanese-American relations, using their unique perspective to bridge cultural gaps that the war had created. Their testimonies about American treatment of prisoners challenged prevailing narratives about enemy brutality. though these accounts were not always welcomed by audiences who had constructed their own understanding of wartime experience around different assumptions. The apple pie became a recurring element in these testimonies, a concrete example of how small acts of cultural sharing could transcend the boundaries of conflict. The seasonal cycles of post-war Japan brought their own emotional challenges for the returnees. Autumn, which had meant apple harvest and increased pie production in American camps, now triggered complex memories and cravings that could not easily be satisfied. Some women planted apple trees in their gardens, hoping to recreate the flavors that had become so emotionally significant during their captivity. These trees, when they eventually bore fruit years later, produced apples that tasted nothing like their American memories, but carried similar emotional weight. The gradual democratization of Japan under American occupation created new opportunities for the former prisoners to process their experiences publicly. Some wrote memoirs or gave interviews describing their captivity, always emphasizing the contrast between their expectations and reality. The apple pie featured prominently in these accounts, not as trivial detail, but as profound symbol of how preconceptions could be overturned by direct experience. These testimonies contributed to a slowly emerging understanding of how warfare could coexist with humanity, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The story of these Japanese women and their encounter with American apple pie reveals something profound about human nature that transcends the boundaries of war and propaganda. In the end, it wasn't military might or political ideology that proved most powerful, but simple acts of dignity extended across enemy lines. The tears shed over that first taste of sweetness were not just about food, but about the shattering of carefully constructed walls between us and them, between enemy and human being. These women returned to Japan forever changed, carrying within them the knowledge that kindness could emerge from the most unlikely sources. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the capacity for compassion endures, sometimes found in the most unexpected places, sometimes tasted in a simple slice of pie served by former enemies who chose to see prisoners as people deserving of basic human dignity.